Good afternoon, and as a family support specialist at PTSI, I welcome you to our lunchtime webinar. Thank you for logging in. Today, we are going to be learning about balancing the sensory system. We have two presenters today. Both are from the University of Virginia's Supporting Transformative Autism Research, the STAR Initiative. We have Emily Meltzer, who is a licensed occupational therapist and research specialist with UVA's STAR program. And we have Dr. Rose Neville, who is an assistant professor and director of Autism Research Core, the Autism Research Core within the University of Virginia's STAR Initiative. She is also a licensed clinical psychologist and a board certified behavior analyst. I am going to let Emily and Rose take over at this moment, and as we're going through the webinar, if you have questions, make sure to click on the Q&A button on the menu. Mine's on the bottom. Yours may be on the top of your screen, but on the bottom or top of your screen, and you can enter your questions. We'll be addressing questions at the end of the webinar, as well as everyone who is attending the webinar today. We will email you a PDF copy of this, the slides for this webinar so that you have those. And we will be uploading this webinar to the PTSI website, and I think UVA STAR may be also uploading to their website. So thank you so much. Emily and Rose, I'm going to turn it over to you guys.
So the contents for today's presentation, we're going to first review what the core sensory domains are in our bodies. I'm going to introduce some sensory terms and talk about the sensory continuum, which is really helpful to think about as we're working to problem solve sensory difficulties and needs in individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. After that, Emily Meltzer is going to jump in and provide some practical solutions for sensory sensitivities. She's also going to talk about a decision tree you can use to figuring out if sensory needs that you may come across are those which require or would benefit from intervention or additional supports. Then at the end, I'm going to talk about what we mean by evidence-based practices and things to think about when you're considering different sensory treatments or therapies for yourselves or your child. And as Tammy mentioned, we're happy to take questions and discussions at the end. So when we think about the sensory domains, I think all of us have heard about those core 5 senses, the senses of smell, sight, touch, taste, and hearing. There's actually 7 sensory systems. Those 2 additional ones are really important to bear in mind when you're supporting someone with IDD, because these can really drive and have a big impact on their experience and their interaction with the world. And those additional sensory systems are the senses of body awareness, or the proprioceptive system, and the vestibular system, or balance. So when you think about when you feel motion sick or car sick, that's that vestibular system telling you something is off about your motion. It's controlled by levels in our inner ear, which is activated by head movement. And it basically gives us information about where the body is in space, how fast the body's moving, and in what direction it is moving. It's really important for helping us keep our balance while we're walking, jumping, running, climbing, and generally moving about in the world. There's also the proprioceptive system, which uses information from our muscles and joints to help us understand what our body position is. So when you think about the fact that when your eyes are closed, you know exactly where your arms and legs are in relation to your torso and your head. That's your proprioceptive system kicking in and telling you that. And this system is really important with helping us manage our balance and coordination. So thinking about a teenager or an adult with IDD who may have difficulty with balance while moving throughout the world, it may be their proprioceptive system that's experiencing sensory difficulties. Some other important sensory terms there's this term that you may have heard of before, which is the sense of hyper-responsiveness. And what we mean by that is when someone has a large, exaggerated, and sometimes negative reaction to specific sensory stimuli. So we may have hyper-responsiveness to specific sounds, specific tastes that we find unpleasant. We may not just have a negative reaction, but that reaction can be really large and over the top, and that can make those sensory experiences really unpleasant for the individual. You may have also heard of the term hypo-responsiveness before, and that's referring to essentially the opposite experience of hyper-responsiveness when we have reduced behavioral responses to sensory information, events, or activities in our environment. When you think about, sometimes we tend to see individuals having under responsiveness or being hypo-responsive to pain and extremes in temperature. And it's not until the sensation from that pain is really high that they seem to pick up on that. That's what we mean by hypo-responsiveness. Another important sensory tend to think about is that oftentimes we as human beings engage in sensory seeking behavior. That's behavior that we actively engage in, we voluntarily engage in, because it provides intense sensory input. So when you think about, we oftentimes fidget, rock, pace back and forth, jiggle your leg, anything like that. Those are examples of sensory seeking behavior when we're engaging in behavior purely for the sensory input that it provides to us. Our sensory system exists along a continuum, so we can range from any event or situation or day from being hyposensitive, undersensitive to oversensitive. Those sensory experience can have a big effect on other aspects of our life and other aspects of our behavior. So how the extent to which we're hypo or hyper-responsive can have an effect on how much we interact with others in our environment, whether we appear withdrawn or very social. It can have an effect on how much we can regulate our own behavior, manage and control our own behavior, or the extent to which we behave impulsively. And it can also have an effect on how irritable or angry we might be from one situation to the next. So in certain situations or certain days, our sensory continuum can look like this. When I look at this, I oftentimes think about how I feel going through an airport when I'm rushing to get to my plane. So in that scenario, I'm hypersensitive. I'm very aware of all the sounds and the smells and the noises going on around me. I don't want to interact with others. I'm withdrawn. I don't want to engage in conversation because I've got a mission in mind. I may also have lower self-regulatory behavior. I may be less likely to let others go in front of me. I may be rushing. I may be trying to jump in front of people in line, and I may be a little bit more irritable. Other days or other events or situations, our sensory continuums can look like this. So say, for example, you're lying on a beach. You may be hyposensitive, so you may be less aware of sensations in your environment that might in other scenarios be irritating, like it's hot, but I'm relaxed, I'm in a happy situation, so I'm less aware of that. I may be, as a result of that, very social. I may be really good in those scenarios at regulating my behavior, and I may overall be relaxed and in a happy mood and experience pretty low levels of anger. So it's really important to bear in mind that the sensory continuum changes from one situation to another within the same individual, and that can have an effect on people's behaviors and responses to their environment. We also tend to see differences in how people habituate to their environment. Habituation and adaptation are terms where we're really thinking about how much we can get used to and adjust to changes in our environment. Adaptation is that process of adjusting itself. we tend to see that individuals with IDD tend to sometimes have an experienced absence of adaptation. They are unable to adjust to changes in stimuli in their environment, or they adjust to those changes differently from you or I. And as a result of that, we may see differences in getting used to stimuli. So, for example, you as a parent or a caregiver or a professional going into a room may initially notice a ticking clock, but habituate to it, get used to it after a few minutes and no longer notice it or be annoyed by it. Another person with IDD may experience that differently. They may have a harder time habituating to those sensations.
Hi, this is Emily Meltzer. I'm going to jump in now with some practical solutions for balancing the sensory system. So initially, I want to start with a little bit of a disclaimer in that everyone's body is different. So the suggestions that I make in the next few slides may or may not work for your child. So keep that in mind as we move through. Finally, this is not an exact science, and so things may change over time. So take that into consideration. Different strategies work for different situations, and then also other factors such as puberty, illness, other things can change kind of what works sensorially over time for your child. So the first kind of area that I want to touch on in terms of practical suggestions is toothbrushing. So an issue for you or for your child may be that the toothbrush hurts. So Rose spoke earlier about that sensory continuum and about how some individuals with IDD may feel sensations differently than you or I may feel sensations. So while a pain stimulus may not hurt nearly as much to your teenager or your child as it would for you, the toothbrush may be just a very aversive sensory experience for them. So you can try a soft or medium bristle toothbrush. The toothbrush in kind of the regular drugstore toothbrushes are typically labeled with the type of bristle that is on there. So look for soft or medium if you have issues there. Or also you could try an electric toothbrush. Sometimes the vibration from the electric motor actually helps with some of that pain kind of reaction that you're seeing. Another issue could be the taste of the toothpaste and the foam that is created by the toothpaste. So my first kind of point here, toothpaste comes in a ton of different flavors, especially the natural types of toothpaste. They've come out with like strawberry flavor, and that may be worth a try in terms of taste of toothpaste. And then finally, thinking about foam. The foam may be a very aversive sensory experience for your child. So looking for toothpaste that do not have sodium lauryl sulfate in them, SLS in them, can be very helpful in kind of finding a toothpaste that works. So the SLS, the sodium lauryl sulfate, is actually what makes the toothpaste foam. So there are a couple of brands that do not have SLS in them. There's a brand from CVS called Closys, CLOSYS, and there's a second brand, Sensodyne Repair and Protect, does not have SLS in it. But just keeping in mind as you're looking at the drugstore for toothpaste, toothpaste that do not have SLS will not foam. So the second kind of hygiene-based practical solution I want to touch on is showering. So an issue you may find is that your child is not tolerating the feel of shampoo. You could try a deep pressure massage. You can either have them do it, you can teach them to do it, or you can do it of the head, ears, and neck prior to putting shampoo in. And then while that shampoo is kind of moving through their head, the idea of really using a fair amount of pressure to move the shampoo through their head may kind of help mitigate that negative reaction. Tilting their head back to rinse the shampoo. So Rose mentioned the idea of the vestibular sense, and that vestibular sense playing into balance. And this may be a pretty significant issue for your child if balance is an issue more generally. This could be kind of exacerbated in the shower because you're in a warm environment. There's a chance that their blood pressure is dropping because of the heat in the room. And so you could see a much larger kind of balance issue in the shower. So you may want to try a shower chair. These can be purchased at the drugstore. Typically, larger drugstores will have a durable medical equipment section in the back of the store. And also any kind of medical equipment provider will have shower chairs. Amazon also carries them. If showering just is not working and it's too much in that situation or for that day, they do make dry shampoo, and then just kind of doing a sponge bath may kind of get you through for that day. So next we're going to think about getting dressed, and these again in bold here are some issues that you may face as a parent. So for your child, the clothing seams may feel uncomfortable. So again, Rose mentioned that kind of sensory continuum and how individuals with IDD may not habituate to those sensory stimuli as quickly as you or I do. So you and I may not feel the seams on our clothes, or maybe right when we put a new sweater on, we feel everything, and then after a few minutes, it kind of goes away. But for an individual with IDD, that kind of new clothing feel may continue and may not go away. That feeling may not go away. So it may be pretty aversive for them. So to kind of mitigate this, you could try having your teenager or your child wear clothing inside out. So this includes underwear and bras. Just turning the item inside out may decrease that negative sensory experience for them. If buttons and snaps are an issue, you could try elastic waistbands or magnet or Velcro closures. Target has a new line of adaptive clothing that most of their items are magnet or Velcro closure items. New clothes feel scratchy or new clothes feel uncomfortable. You as a parent are finding yourself washing new clothes 3 or 4 or 5 times before your child will wear them. One way to help kind of speed up the process is putting a ½ cup of baking soda into the wash cycle. You may not have to wash that item nearly as much for it to get it to feel kind of soft and comfortable. Thinking about seasonal changes when it comes to dressing, providing 2 full outfit options for your child to kind of give that control back to them when the seasons change, and also to allow for some flexibility on their part. So if they've been wearing short sleeves all summer, maybe as the weather gets cooler, they wear a short sleeve t-shirt and a soft hoodie rather than switching to a long sleeve shirt. So just kind of allowing for some flexibility and some options in seasonal clothing. When moving from warm to cool weather, as we are now, as we move into fall, so in the summer, your child may have been wearing, or your teenager may have been wearing like exercise pants or basketball shorts. And so it may have been very easy for them to go to the bathroom and to kind of feel that when they got to the bathroom, all they had to do was pull everything down and they were kind of good to go. But now that we're moving into cooler weather, if your child is wearing pants with buttons and snaps, that may actually create a little bit of anxiety around getting to the bathroom fast enough. So now not only do they need to feel the urge to go to the bathroom, they also need to get there and then spend a few extra seconds, if not longer, undoing all those buttons and snaps. So that could cause a little bit of an issue in terms of, for them, in terms of not wanting to switch to pants, because that sense of control is then kind of taken away or decreased a little bit. So going for pants with an elastic waistband may make a lot of sense. And as I mentioned, Target actually has in their adaptive clothing line, they have many pants that look nice, and they have an elastic waistband. So they look professional, you look put together, but it's an elastic closure rather than a button closure. Moving from cool to warm weather, just watching water intake and making sure that your teenager is getting enough water as they decide to wear sweaters when it is 80 degrees outside. And eventually, they should come around, but just the idea of making sure that they're staying hydrated. So continuing on with our theme of getting dressed, if we're thinking about socks and shoes, again, the idea of seams and turning socks inside out may be all that you need to kind of decrease the aversive sensory experience that putting on socks can cause. In terms of shoes, if the shoes are too tight, you may want to ask your shoe salesperson to help you pick out shoes that have a rounded toe box. That allows the toes to have a little bit more space in the shoe and feel less kind of crowded in there. You can also think about buying shoes a half size larger than your child's foot measures. If the shoes feel too loose, you can try tighter socks that have spandex as one of the items that the socks are made of. You can also try deep pressure right before the shoes go on. And then right after they go on, encouraging your child to do jumping jacks or stomp or run to kind of use the proprioceptive sense that Rose was talking about earlier to kind of mitigate that sensory experience of having shoes on. So engaging in some quick physical activity right after the shoes go on may help with that sensory issue. I want to touch a little bit on puberty here. I think that it's an area that gets kind of short-shrifted a lot of the time. And I think OT and Rose is a BCBA, and I think that we are pretty well positioned to actually talk about it in a pretty in-depth way. So bear with me here as we go through some puberty sensory strategies. These primarily, we have it broken down, so they primarily, we're going to look at males and females, and then we have another slide that looks primarily at females. So thinking about shaving, the idea of desensitization to the razor. So that's kind of getting your child used to the look of the razor, the feel of the razor, the routine around shaving may be really helpful. So this could be done certainly with the plastic cap on the blade and just kind of either through a visual schedule or breaking down the task just as a way to kind of get your child used to the idea of a razor. The Gillette company has also made a new razor in the last year, about a year now, where it allows for the caregiver to actually shave the individual in a much easier fashion than before. So it has a little bit of a different handle, and it has a slightly different angle of the blade to make the shaving experience easier on the caregiver and easier on the individual. So next I'll talk a little bit about masturbation and that kind of as a sensory need. So teaching teenagers that the only appropriate place to masturbate is in their own bedroom is a really important piece here as we think about teenagers moving into puberty. So a lot of times you'll hear that teaching either the bedroom or the bathroom is fine, and that's typically what clinicians will do. But my personal take on it is that if your child generalizes that idea of that they're able to masturbate in the bathroom at home, and so why aren't they able to do that in the bathroom at school or in the bathroom out in the community? So I prefer to teach that the only acceptable place for that is their own bedroom. In terms of kind of more generally thinking about sensory issues as we move into puberty, sensory sensitivities may change and they may intensify during puberty, primarily because of all the hormones and all the bodily changes that are happening. Other potential changes that we want to be cognizant of include sleep and effectiveness of medications. So again, all of those bodily changes can really have a large effect on sleep and also on how meds work kind of as we think about kind of medical conditions and also as we think about behavioral meds too. So that's just something to keep in mind when being in touch with your child's pediatrician or internal medicine doctor as they move through puberty. And then finally, using social stories as a teaching tool. So for natural occurrences like bedwetting in males and erections in males, thinking about using a social story to not only teach that, but also kind of make it seem like a normal bodily function may be a really helpful strategy for teaching and for kind of thinking about those ideas. So next we're going to focus a little bit on menstrual care for females. So there are, if you think about it kind of as a female, there are a lot of routines around menstruation that you've kind of just integrated into your day-to-day life. But for an individual with IBD, it may be harder than that. So using a visual schedule showing times to change their pad, or even using a phone alarm or alerts to check or change a pad may be helpful, especially when puberty is first hitting and that routine is not kind of integrated into their day-to-day life yet. Use of feminine products, similar to the razor, the idea of desensitization. So kind of getting the individual used to the idea of wearing a pad. They make like mini pads or underwear liners, and it may be helpful to just kind of use those prior to a period actually happening, to get your teenager used to the idea of wearing that, because it is a sensory experience. It certainly is a different feeling than they've probably ever felt before. So there are also new period underwear. I think the most kind of well-known brand right now is Thinx, T-H-I-N-X. And I don't have too much personal experience with period underwear clinically, but I do know that they tend to work and they tend to kind of be a way to move away from pads if that is just not working. Menstrual cramping, a lot of times, you know, when kind of less medical interventions don't work, it may be kind of natural to reach for a Tylenol or an Advil to decrease that cramping sensation, but making sure that you double check potential drug interactions with your child's pediatrician is probably crucial when thinking about including an over-the-counter pain medication as far as menstrual cramping and puberty goes. So we're gonna segue out of puberty and think about practical solutions for around town or out in the community. So before leaving the house, it may be helpful to have a checklist of all of the items that your teenager may need before they head out the door. So having that checklist up right by the front door or even on the front door may be helpful to just give a visual reminder of, you know, do I have my lunchbox? Do I have my folders? Do I have any medication that I need? Things like that. In terms of kind of moving about in the community, when we think about motion sickness, and Rose mentioned earlier that vestibular sense of kind of the sense of balance and the sense of where your body is in space, a practical tip for this may be having the teenager sit in the front seat if their weight allows it. I think you have to be over 80 pounds to sit in the front seat, but that may be a helpful tip, as well as having them look out the front window and then kind of visually jump between stationary objects. So looking straight ahead and then kind of just using their eyes to jump from object to object, that the objects themselves aren't moving. So that's going to help the inner ear to kind of rebalance itself and hopefully decrease some of that sense of motion sickness. Thinking about using public transit, you may want to opt for headphones, headphones with or without music, and also using fidget toys or calming items when using public transit, especially if it tends to get pretty crowded. And then also thinking about using competing items when out and about in the community. So these are preferred items that may distract from the busy environment and may give the individual something else to focus on besides kind of the visual stimuli that are going on around them. And finally, planning shopping trips and activities for quieter times of the day. This may just kind of, in general, make for an easier time for everybody. So we're going to think about sleep briefly. Go back. And kind of practical solutions around sleep. So thinking about setting your electronics, this includes your phone, your iPad, any tablets or anything like that, to night mode. This decreases the blue light. So blue light is actually when your phone or your tablet is up during the day, blue light and yellow light are both coming through equally. But at night, you can set it to night mode, and this will remove the blue light. It'll change the color a little bit. It'll make it look a little more yellow or a little more orange. But blue light is extremely alerting to the brain. So if you reduce or decrease that blue light, your child may be able to kind of get to sleep faster. And ideally, you would stop using electronics about an hour before bedtime. But for some, that's just not practical. And so the idea of moving the electronic device into night mode may kind of really help with sleep. In terms of the sleep environment, so your teenager's room should be kept dark, and it should actually be kept cool. So a little bit cooler than is probably comfortable during the day. And actually, the body sleeps best and is able to kind of move into that REM sleep best when people in general are a little bit cooler. And then in terms of noise, trying a fan or trying a white noise machine may help kind of trigger that sleep response for an individual with IDD. And then also limiting food before bed. A couple hours before bed may be really helpful too. The digestive system actually shuts down as you sleep and kind of starts to, it really does slow down as you start to go to sleep. And then when you're sleeping, it really slows down. So if you're eating a lot before bed, it may be hard for you to get to sleep and to get good quality sleep. And then finally, thinking about some relaxation strategies. So a warm bath or a deep pressure massage or listening to music may help kind of calm everyone down before bed. So this last piece that I'm going to go over is a sensory decision tree. So thinking about whether the sensory issues that your child is facing warrant some further intervention or some further consultation from either a behaviorist or an occupational therapist. So is the sensory issue affecting daily functioning? Yes or no? If the answer is no, you can allow the behavior to happen or allow the sensory experience to happen. I'll give an example of that in a second. But if the answer is yes, and it is really affecting daily functioning, you want to teach and provide coping strategies. So some of the strategies that I mentioned today may be very helpful in kind of mitigating some of that behavior. And if it's really affecting daily functioning, you may want to consult an occupational therapist for outpatient services. So going back to the idea of the no answer and whether the sensory issue is affecting daily functioning. When I was working clinically, I had a parent come up to me after an IEP meeting in school, and she said, my child is, every time we go out into the community, my child touches all of the cars. She likes to touch the hood of all of the cars as we walk to, into a store from our car. And, should I be concerned about that? Because, she just keeps doing it and I can't get her to stop doing it. And I asked her specifically, does this interfere with, safety? Are you able to, if you tell her, you need to hold my hand and we need to walk faster because there's a car coming, is she able to kind of break that cycle and focus on you and do what she needs to do to be safe? And the mom said, yeah, she's fine. She's able to do that. And so my answer to her in terms of whether to be concerned about that sensory behavior was essentially no, and allowing the behavior to happen and allowing her to kind of, the child obviously to me had in those moments, had a tactile need and she was sensory seeking in those moments. But when needed, she could kind of be pulled from that experience and she could kind of refocus. So the idea of thinking about whether it's really affecting daily functioning is probably a good place to start in terms of whether to seek help or not. And I think Rose is going to jump in now and talk a little bit about evidence-based practice.
So we wanted to wrap up this presentation talking about or providing some ideas on how to problem solve what treatment approaches to use as parents with a child or family member. Because oftentimes what happens is we tend to see a long list of options that are out there that are recommended to us, which makes it really challenging to figure out, okay, what strategy should I use? What strategy is worth spending the time to pursue? It can be particularly difficult because a lot of these different options that are presented to you may be promoted by really persuasive people. They're sincere, they're well-meaning, and they're trying to help you figure out the best solution to a challenge you or your family may be experiencing. As oftentimes we experience this scenario as well, that everyone claims that their favorite treatment works. One question that I've worked through with families a lot in my clinical experience is the idea of what do you do when the evidence base for treatment suggests one thing, but a family member has a close friend or relative who says that it worked for their child. Because oftentimes as caregivers, when you're caring for a child with intellectual and developmental disabilities, you may feel alone in that process, or you may feel like it's difficult to access information about what the evidence is showing you. So the next logical option is to turn to friends and trusted family members who can say, well, this worked for my child because that's almost the best next option. And then we also tend to hear from others that they can tend to say, hey, this seems to be working for me, that seems to be working for our family, so that could suggest that it might be a good approach for you to pursue for your child. What we're going to present on it today is some other questions to ask yourself as you're making treatment decisions to make sure that you're pursuing options that have the most likelihood of being able to work for you and your child. So the first step is to look for evidence that's available to support claims that you're hearing from professionals or friends or family members who are suggesting that you may want to pursue a particular treatment or therapy. because the fact is that not all evidence is created equal. Sometimes we may experience wishful thinking about the evidence. We may think, oh, I really like the idea or the sound of this intervention. So people may experience wishful thinking, generating more evidence that's in their mind than is necessarily out there. Is there solid proof? Can you find information in books, on the internet, in leaflets from doctors that suggests that this intervention is going to work? Oftentimes in history, especially when you think about the history of treatment and therapies that have been available for individuals with and children with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as our knowledge about treatments have grown, we tend to see a shift over time. So in the beginning, as we began to learn about intellectual and developmental disabilities, there were a lot of what we call pseudo-scientific approaches out there, approaches to treatment and therapy that weren't really based on evidence. And what we know is that the more science has evolved, the more our knowledge and understanding has evolved, the more we've been able to shift into identifying what scientific-based approaches to treatment are, and treatments that are, in other words, most likely to work. So for you as a caregiver, you may ask yourself, when you hear about a new intervention or treatment, is this pseudoscience? Is this a treatment that's actually going to be likely to work? So you can ask yourself these key questions to figure out, is this something that's worth investing the time in? So pseudoscience oftentimes tends to be accompanied by testimonials and anecdotes, short stories about it working, as opposed to statistics and percentages that suggest how many people it's worked for in the past. Pseudoscientific approaches also tend to lack scientific support. So if you Google these interventions or look them up on the internet or reference books, you may struggle to find any sites or websites or information out there that suggest, hey, this was evaluated in several studies to indicate that this has worked with a large number of people. We also want to really see if these interventions have had research published that are out there. So sometimes you may find that you may not be able to access peer-reviewed journals that publish the research if you don't have access to an academic-based library system, but you can usually access a short, layperson-friendly description of that article through those websites. So Google those interventions, look them up and see, is there evidence out there that has been published and produced to say that this works? What we also know about pseudoscientific approaches is that it's really hard to test them, i.e. if it's an intervention that hasn't been evaluated and tested and proven to be effective, it's also oftentimes the case that we're unable to actually test whether or not it truly works. It tends to be promoted through internet ads rather than doctors, journals, and professionals. And then it oftentimes also tends to be promoted using catchy, emotionally charged and emotionally appealing slogans. And I think my next slide is going to provide some examples of that. So we saw, as I mentioned, in previous decades, examples of pseudoscientific interventions. Here's an example of an ad: I cure women of female disease and piles. So this is a really extreme claim, right? So when you think about it, what could possibly be out there that cures all women of all diseases? It's likely that this may be a bigger claim than actually what the actual quality to that intervention is. So other elements to be wary of: pseudoscientific approaches tend to have really high quote-unquote success reports claimed. They tend to promise rapid effects. They tend to claim effects for many different symptoms. The theory, or when you ask someone promoting this intervention about the theory behind this intervention, oftentimes can contradict common sense. So oftentimes we tend to discount our common sense, but when hearing about such interventions, rely on that. You as a caregiver, you have a lot of knowledge and you know your child best. So as you hear someone explain an intervention to you, rely on your common sense, because that oftentimes can steer you in the right direction about deciding whether or not an intervention or therapy is worth pursuing. Oftentimes, these interventions also claim to be easy to administer, requiring little training and expertise. So thinking about those QVC ads about cleaning products or different hair regrowing treatments, those are examples of strategies that they often use that are along the same lines. It works immediately, or it works in 2 weeks. Your whole head of hair will be regrown if you just use this product, and it's only $19.95. So really sort of exaggerated claims like that are oftentimes good signs that you should be wary of an intervention. Also, it's important to be aware of treatments when it's clear that the promoters tend to benefit financially or otherwise. When the promoters say that you need belief and faith in the intervention in order for it to successfully work. And I've got, Emily just reminded me of the time, so I'm going to speed up through this last slide here, and we can jump back to that if we have specific questions from the audience. But some examples of some pseudoscientific interventions that Emily, as a licensed OT, has come across in the OT world are weighted vest, brushing techniques, and weighted blankets. There tend to be really limited evidence to suggest that these are effective. And when you think about some of the examples I just gave, oftentimes these strategies are promoted by saying these are really easy to use, they're quick to use, they work straight away, all you need to do is put the vest on or put a blanket on and you'll find rapid results for your child's mood, sensory responsivity, and self-regulation. So being wary of examples like that, good examples of how to, some problem solving to use as you're going forward, problem solving through which interventions to choose for your child. So what does evidence-based practice mean? Well, you really want to have clinicians who are working with you to guarantee that they're going to use evaluation to make sure that the intervention they're recommending is going to be working and useful for your child. The clinician should be using procedures that have been studied carefully and the results have been reviewed and published. It's your right as a parent to ask your clinician to provide evidence that these interventions have been published and proven through scientific research. Another important strategy for proving that the intervention is evidence-based is the clinicians showing and regularly collecting data on your child's results when that intervention has been applied with them. So you want to regularly ask your clinician, your therapist, to provide data and evidence that the intervention is working for your child. And to wrap up that concept, evidence-based practice really means that we're not just relying only on one source of information. We're using a combination of sources of information. We're looking at the individual characteristics of your child, using that and combining it with your professional therapist expertise and experience, and then also asking that professional to provide you evidence using research and the science that's out there to show you that this is an intervention that's going to work for your child.
So this is Emily. These are some resources that are evidence-based and that many of the suggestions from this presentation were pulled from. So especially the ones on the right, the Healthy Bodies Toolkits, those were created by researchers at Vanderbilt University, and they really provide some great practical tips for thinking about as your child moves into puberty and adolescence. All right, so we're going to open it up for questions, I think.
Thanks so much, ladies. Really appreciate that. If you guys could, if you have questions, please put those through on the Q&A down below, and I will read those out to Emily and Rose, and we will answer those. I know we had one question already. Someone asked, what is IDD versus SPD?
That's a great question. And so I apologize for not explaining those acronyms earlier. So IDD refers to intellectual and developmental disabilities. This is an overarching description that we use to describe developmental disabilities or developmental disorders, including autism, developmental delay, SPD, ADHD, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, essentially those conditions that are present from birth or early childhood and tend to persist across the lifespan. Sensory processing disorder is a new diagnosis that describes, I'm actually going to let Emily describe that because she's more qualified than I to talk about SPD.
So just to jump in here, sensory processing disorder, Rose is right. It's a relatively new diagnosis in the last 5 years or so. And practitioners and pediatricians are kind of just starting to give the SPD diagnosis. It's a little bit controversial in the sense that the diagnostic criteria for SPD are still being formulated. So that SPD diagnosis has actually not been put into the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. It has been. Rose is correct. It has been. And so just kind of the idea of SPD as kind of a standalone diagnosis. Typically, it'll come with other things, but SPD as kind of a standalone diagnosis essentially means that your child or teenager may just experience the world from a sensory perspective a little bit differently than typically developing peers or than peers who don't have some sensory challenges.
Great. We have another question. This one's about school specific and sensory issues. It says, what are tips to inform and bring along educators so they can properly address sensory issues at school? For example, the student doesn't like the way the desk feels, the lighting is too dim, classroom feels cramped, etc.
Yeah, so in terms of kind of sensory strategies for the classroom, the American Occupational Therapy Association, AOTA, has some really good resources on their website about short handouts for teachers with kind of information about sensory issues. And then also they list some practical tips for educators as to kind of how to better accommodate students with sensory issues.
From the parent perspective, it can oftentimes be really hard to figure out how to balance, what you know about what is most helpful for your child and making sure that those needs get taken into account in the educational system when an educator has to also keep the sensory and educational needs of other students in mind in the classroom at the same time. What we generally recommend is, as a parent, working together and taking the stance of being a collaborator with the educator, providing those strategies to educators in easy to digest formats, such as Emily suggested with those brief handouts, emailing them to have them, talking to them during PTA meetings, and really explaining to the teacher that these are the sensory needs of your child that you found to be helpful at home and may be really important in understanding some behavioral or attention issues that they are seeing in the classroom. These are also really appropriate topics to bring up during your IEP meeting.
Great, thank you. We did have a question. Someone's asking about emailing the slides, and yes, if you have attended the webinar, we will be emailing you a PDF of the slides from this webinar, as well as you will be able to view it online once we get that uploaded. We will use the email that you used when you registered to attend. And if you're not sure that that was correct or there might have been a typo, then feel free to email me at PETSI, which is Burns, B-U-R-N-S, @PETSI.org, and we'll make sure that you get those. Any other questions out there before we stop for today? Any other questions? Oh, here's one. I come from an ABA background and wonder, hold on, sorry. I'm not sure if you can, the person who wrote that, if you could just rewrite that in a different way. I'm not sure what you're asking quite yet.
And while we're waiting for that, if I can just add in, we want to be really respectful of everyone's time today. We do have some research opportunities we wanted to share with you as well. So if it's okay, Tammy, we'll just email those out to everyone, and we have contact information on those slides. So please feel free to reach out to us at any time if you have any questions or interested in any of the research opportunities that we share with you.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to stop for today. If you have additional questions that have not gotten answered, again, feel free to email those to me and I will get those to both Emily and Rose. Burns@PETSI.org is where you can email those. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks. Especially thank you to Emily and Rose for taking your time to present this. And I hope everybody has a good rest of your week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.